Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Earth Justice is a national legal nonprofit fighting to protect people's health, to preserve magnificent places and wildlife, and to combat climate change. Visit us at earthjustice.org. Earth Justice, because the earth needs a good lawyer.
Hello audience, wherever you may hail. Welcome to The Focus. I'm your host, John Bruni. This is our first Sage International The Focus podcast after having migrated from weekly broadcasting with Radio Adelaide. We had to change to a podcasting format due to pressing professional commitments. Podcasting is a great platform since it allows us to take more time with our product, more flexibility in when we can conduct interviews, and in a COVID environment gives us the ability to operate from the safety of our respective desktops. We still aim to give you an excellent listening experience, exploring some of Australia's and the world's most pressing contemporary social, political and economic issues, shedding a spot of light in a world filled with alternative fact darkness. So come with us on a journey into the light by following The Focus, hosted by the Ozcast Network, Australia's coolest podcasting platform. In this episode, our first guest is Rami Khouri, who will speak to us about the disintegration of the Lebanese state. Rami is Director of Global Engagement, Adjunct Professor of Journalism and Senior Public Policy Fellow at the American University of Beirut. Rami is also non-resident Senior Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School and a syndicated columnist at Agence Global and The New Arab. Rami, welcome to The Focus.
Thanks. Glad to be with you.
From an outsider's view, Lebanon has been in a sort of slow-motion freefall for a very long time. But this freefall has now accelerated to the point where it seems that the state of Lebanon is about to completely fail. Can you explain to our listeners what caused this catastrophic tipping point?
It's very clear that over the last 15 years or so, really since around 2005, 2010, something like that, the oligarchic sectarian elite that controls the whole country. There's about 12, 15, 20 men who are the leaders of sectarian groups, all of whom have allotted shares in parliament, and they have controlled the country basically on their own. After the Syrians left in 2005, these men took complete control of power. There still is the facade of participation democracy. There's a parliament, there's a relatively open press, there's a judiciary which is less and less independent, but essentially this group controls everything. They've allowed corruption to expand, they've let public services deteriorate, they've let the private sector enrich itself and enrich themselves at the same time, and they've allowed the currency to collapse, and all the fundamental structures of the economy, trade, savings, investment, all of these things have deteriorated. And this has been going on for about 10, 15 years. I mean, people could see it happening, but nobody did anything because people were living a decent life, even middle-class Lebanese, because the currency was subsidized by a Ponzi scheme at the central bank. Everybody was benefiting, and therefore nothing changed until about a year and a half, 2 years ago, when things really started to collapse, because essentially the government ran out of foreign exchange, and the dollar deposits in the banks were all used by the government to finance essential imports and pay back debt, foreign debt. And therefore, once you run out of foreign exchange, you can't really finance imports as well as you could of essentials like medicine and fuel oil and food. And that's when we hit bottom.
What does that actually say about the quality of Lebanon's politicians? I mean, is there any hope among the younger generation that you will get a better quality of politician coming through? Because quite frankly, when I listen to you, I think to myself, where is the pride of these people? I mean, they are leading a state. They're now leading a state to ruin.
Yeah, the state itself, by the way, not just in Lebanon and the entire Arab region, I've recently written about this, the state is problematic in much of the Arab world, only in the sense that most states have not really anchored their stability and prosperity and viability, have not anchored it in the consent of the governed. They haven't given their people the ability and the right to elect leaders, to hold them accountable, to participate in policymaking. And therefore, the state itself never really took hold in Lebanon and in other countries. Sectarian interests are the most important. In other countries, like, say, Jordan or Kuwait or other Iraq, it's tribal interests as well, Syria. And of course, you have tremendous foreign interference in these countries, which has been going on since the late 19th centuries, before they were even sovereign countries. The answer to your question, to your other half of the question, is that there are tremendously talented and dynamic and honest and effective and creative and really efficient and just wonderful young Lebanese men and women all over the country. And they're the ones who are leading the opposition and the protest movements. And now they're slowly being elected to the professional associations, the Engineers Association, the Lawyers Association. They're slowly trying to come into power through that door, because the parliamentary elections are pretty much controlled by the ruling elite. But there's massive human talent in Lebanon. And it's one of the anomalies of this situation. How can a country with such human talent allow itself to be run into the ground by its own corrupt and inept and uncaring leaders? And nobody has really been able to answer that question, other than to say, well, they've been so mesmerized by the power and making money that for them and their cronies, they've been so mesmerized that they don't know how to do anything else, and they refuse to make reforms, they refuse to budge, and therefore the situation gets worse and worse and worse and worse.
How has the civil war in neighboring Syria contributed to Lebanon's ill fortunes?
Well, Syria's control of Lebanon for about 25 years or so created a situation where the Lebanese just did not really govern themselves. And when the Syrians withdrew, there was quite a vacuum, and it was immediately filled by the former warlords in the civil war and some patriarchal sectarian leaders. Immediately they got together and created this oligarchic elite, ruling elite, that basically ran the country. They allotted shares of power, so they'd say, Michel Aoun's people have to take the electricity, the energy ministry, and Hariri's people have to take the foreign ministry, and they allocated power. And then, of course, through that, they could allocate jobs and investments and contracts. And the Syrians allowed corruption to become very prevalent. And the Lebanese, of course, many Lebanese, not all, were happy to go along with this.
I'm just wondering, how does Southern Lebanese Hezbollah also fit into Lebanon's fragmentation and ongoing dysfunction?
The role and position of Hezbollah is really one of the great mysteries of the Lebanon situation. Hezbollah is the strongest political and military group in the country. It's stronger than the government in all ways. It has supported this sectarian system. It has allowed it to flourish. It could have single-handedly refused to let this degradation happen and this regression by saying, no, we have to stop the economic collapse. We've got to reinvigorate the political system. We have to do this and this and this, but it didn't. It went along with the warlords and the oligarchic corrupt elite, and it took shares. It had its own ministries. It played the game like everybody else. And therefore, in the public's eye, Hezbollah is no longer seen as something separate from the corrupt state. It's seen as part of the system, which is a blow to it. But it doesn't particularly care because it's so strong. It can do whatever it really wants. But it is the key to what happens in the country. If Hezbollah were suddenly to say, look, we can't allow this to keep going, or people can't eat, our country men and women don't have jobs, the water now is in danger, electricity has almost disappeared in many parts of the country. If Hezbollah says we've got to stop this, it can knock heads together and insist on forming a different government, do the reforms, agree with the IMF, revitalize the economy, and then create a non-corrupt political system. In theory, it can be done. In practice, it hasn't done that. And essentially, you have two real political actors in Lebanon today. One is Hezbollah, and the other is the mass of people we just call the protest movement. And they're trying to organize mainly now for the parliamentary and presidential elections of 2022, next May. They're trying to organize to win power through the elections. That's not clear that's not clear that's possible. The ruling elite has shown one thing very clearly, and by the way, not just in Lebanon. I've written a long analysis of Sudan, Algeria, Iraq, and Lebanon, the four countries where protests have been going on for 2 years now, calling for the entire removal of the government. This is what's important to note about the current Arab uprisings. They're not just saying change the leader or reform this or lower the price of bread. They're saying we want the entire political class to get out of here, go home, retire, just leave, and reinvigorate and legitimize the entire political system. So they've shown, the ruling elite has shown that it can stall and stall and stall, that it can make little promises, it can negotiate and not carry out anything serious. The idea that the opposition, the protest movement, which is supported by around 80% of Lebanese, we know from polling and other evidence, and this is true all over the region, there's vast support for these protest movements. The idea that they can win the elections and take over the government strikes me as a little bit too optimistic, because the government has many ways to defer the elections, to stall them, to rig them, to terrorize people. So we'll see what happens. But Hezbollah remains a part of the problem in terms of governance. It hasn't shown what it wants to do in terms of being part of the solution.
I suspect that the only real fix here is to go back to year zero. But as you say, if you even flag that publicly, and I assume that quite a few people have been flagging it, that will get the government up, and that will also get them ready for violence. And violence is going to be an outcome of whatever the solution happens to be, because eventually the protesters will get sick of protesting. There will be a clique within the protesters who will want to seize power, which then leads us to a whole heap of other issues, which we will go on to. But for now, is there anything that can arrest Lebanon's collapse?
Oh, yes. What Lebanon is going through is something that other countries have gone through. It's just a little bit more dramatic in Lebanon, the way it's happened so quickly. The reversal of the current situation clearly requires an emergency government with a technocratic cabinet, stabilizing the value of the Lebanese lira. That requires a deal with the IMF, which the IMF is ready to do, has been ready for a year, stabilize the currency, reinvigorate economic investment and economic activity, including just basic trade and production. So revive the economy, fix the banking system so that people can get access to their money, which is now in the banks that they can't get access to. And these things can happen one after the other. They're not going to happen instantly, but this is like a 4-month process where once you get a new government of credible people, and they start addressing the big issues, including, for instance, electricity, generating electricity. Once these things start happening, there'll be a quick reversal of people's fears, and people will start realizing that change is on the way. And then the massive expatriate Lebanese community around the world will kick in. And there's probably around $15-20 billion that's ready around the world to be invested or given in loans or somehow put into the economy. So there's a lot of goodwill to Lebanon and a massive expatriate community that can help. But nothing is going to change if these rulers who are now ruling the country, if they stay in power. And they have given no sign that they're willing to step aside or even make any significant reforms. And this is the great dilemma. How do you budge a powerful elite that has had 30, 40 years to develop networks of crony capitalists and supporters and loyalists, and is willing to use violence? This is the other thing that's troubling in Lebanon. Lebanon had been different than most other Arab countries in that you did not have a strong centralized state that mistreated its people and beat them up, like Egypt or Morocco or Libya or Syria or other places. Lebanon's central state was always slightly weaker than others, and power was diffused through the private sector and other means. Then in the last 2 years, the central government has resorted more and more to military and security measures, beating up people, sending in the army and the police, and also arresting people, taking people to court for tweeting something that insults the president, intimidating people through the legal system. Most of these cases eventually get thrown out of court because they're not really based on anything tangible. But it's just the attempt by the government to use its power, military and other, to keep down people's activism and their desires. And this is new, and it's very troubling. And what you have in the meantime is a citizenry that is about 60, 70% poor, according to UN and World Bank data. So you have the pauperization of the citizenry and the militarization of the state. And that's a terrible combination to have. But this is common, again, throughout many, many Arab countries, not all of them, but many of them.
I'm John Bruni, and you're listening to Sage International's The Focus podcast, and we are speaking with Rami Khouri on the fate of Lebanon. Rami, what's your take on the international community's response to the Lebanese political crisis?
The international community, such as it is, responded pretty normally, as it always has over the years, saying that Lebanon shouldn't collapse. There's many dangers if Lebanon collapses. And it came up with proposals, it came up with offers of aid. But one critical thing that happened in the last year and a half that never happened before, which is that international donors, whether it was the IMF or unilateral, bilateral aid from countries or the EU or whatever, they said, we're not going to give you a penny or a lira until you put in a technocratic government that can start addressing fundamental issues of electricity, water, corruption, etc. And Lebanese government hasn't done any of that. And the international community, often through the French President Macron, he came twice to Lebanon, and other people have been involved. The Americans have been involved, the Saudis, the UN. They've all said, look, we've got all this money, we're ready to come in and help. But we need real change, and real change is not something that the ruling power structure wants to do. So I think the international community has done a reasonably honorable job, and the protesters are very happy that the international community is not giving direct aid to the government like it used to, because they think the money is going to be stolen or put in a Swiss bank account or something. So a lot of aid is coming directly to non-governmental organizations, civil society groups, churches, mosques, educational institutes, health centers. This is one of the fascinating new developments that's going on now on the ground. And I was just in Beirut for a couple of weeks recently. I go back and forth. The new development is that many Lebanese, while they're also angry and fearful and complaining, are also taking command of their own life. They're taking charge of rebuilding parts of Beirut that were badly damaged in the port explosion about a year ago, last August. They're looking at essential services, food, medicine, education, sanitation, etc. So a lot of people, a lot of citizens are taking care of their own well-being and setting an example for the government, saying this is how a good government should operate. And what they're hoping to do is translate this dynamic and the goodwill that it brings from the citizenry, translate it into success in the elections next year.
Obviously, all the current socio-political failings of the Lebanese government are also highlighted by its response to COVID-19. Please tell our listeners how the political crisis in Lebanon has hindered domestic public safety efforts.
The COVID crisis in Lebanon, as in most of the Arab countries, has both helped and hurt the government. It hurt the government by quickly revealing that the public health system had very badly deteriorated, partly because the political elite, privatized so many health services and allowed their crony capitalist friends to own and run hospitals and health clinics and blood centers and whatever as a private business to make a lot of money. And therefore, the public health system deteriorated, and this country wasn't ready to deal with it. And that was one thing that hurt. The second thing that happened is that the government really had no clear policy on vaccination or prevention other than just make a curfew, and people couldn't do that for very long because many people just get paid a daily wage. They work for a day, they get the equivalent of whatever, $10, $15, $20, and they can't afford to not work. So we're shutting down the economy, we're shutting down the country by the government, and the reduced international trade and tourism and things like that badly hurt the economy and quickly increased the level of poverty and need in the country, driving it, like I said, up to around 60, 70% of Lebanese are now poor. The other side of this, though, is that what happened after the first 6 months is that the sectarian leaders, the people who were responsible for the collapse of Lebanon, realized that they could actually gain from this. And they started bringing in their own vaccines and extra food and extra medicines, which were running out of, and the pharmacies were disappearing because there wasn't enough foreign exchange to buy them. So they started importing essentials, each political party or sectarian group, and giving it to their own people. This was a very crass example of sectarian welfare paternalism at work, but it did work, and this is what they do, and it gained them some support among their people who already supported them, though. But it created greater anger against them by the public at large, saying what these people are supposed to be national leaders, and they're just helping their own people. So I think the net effect of the corona has been negative in the country in all ways.
What is the state of the Lebanese army? Sage International's non-resident fellow Greater Middle East, Dr. Imad K. Harb, recently put out a Sage policy brief on Lebanon, where he said that the army was Lebanon's last bastion against civil disorder. How do you see the role of the Lebanese army in holding back the tide of disunity?
The Lebanese army in Lebanon has always been a gentle, fragile, limited institution, mainly because the Israelis and the Americans would never allow it to become really strong so that it doesn't threaten Israel. And that's why Hezbollah grew, because Hezbollah wouldn't stand for the Israeli constant invasions and occupations and destruction in Lebanon, and therefore Hezbollah became strong and has now had a situation of deterrence with the Israelis. They haven't had a war for many years. So the Lebanese army has always been limited in its capabilities. And it has been really mostly an internal security mechanism more than defending against foreign attacks. It's also very fragile in its sectarian makeup with Sunnis and Shiites and Druze and Christians. But it has held together since it was rebuilt after the Syrians left. It has held together well. Most people, the vast majority of Lebanese want the army to be successful. It has played a positive role in the current crisis by coming in and restoring security in situations where there was fighting, like in Tripoli in the north or other places. The army and the internal security do most of the direct contact with citizens, including beating up protesters. But the army has been used a little bit in putting down protests, and they have to be very careful about this. The fear was what happened during the Civil War is that if the army gets involved in internal issues, it'll split along sectarian lines and it'll fall apart. The Shiites will go one way, the Sunnis somewhere else, the Maronites somewhere else. So they're very careful to avoid that. And it's ironic, there have been conferences in Paris, international conferences to raise money just for the army. And Qatar the other day sent a plane load of food just for the army. So the army is seen as a critical institution in the country that really has to be supported, and it can provide a security basis on which political rebirth can happen.
And finally, what does a weak and fractious Lebanon mean for the Lebanese people and the Middle East more broadly?
The situation now is the majority of Lebanese in Lebanon, and when I say majority, I'm talking 70-80%, are suffering economically, medicine, health-wise, food, water, energy. It's incredible that every dimension of life has deteriorated, except for the very rich who are linked to the sectarian ruling elite. They don't feel any of these things, but the vast majority do. They're angry, they're upset, they're humiliated. They actually feel, I've used the term, they feel dehumanized. They feel like their own people have treated them like animals. They're used to being treated by animals by foreign invaders, if it's the Americans or before that, the French and the British and people from overseas coming in and beating them up. I mean, this happens in colonial situations. But when your own people do this to you, you really feel terrible. And what compounds this is that they just can't seem to do anything about it. They've tried mass street demonstrations. They've tried voting. They've tried boycotts, strikes. They've tried shaming politicians in public. They've tried every feasible nonviolent mean. And there's even been a few incidents where a couple of protesters broke off from a peaceful march and attacked a bank or something. But it's massively nonviolent and peaceful, and it's getting nowhere. The ruling elite just won't budge. So people are just completely bewildered. They don't know what to do, but they have to get on with day-to-day life. They got to get up and send their kids to school if the schools are working, try to work if they have a job, get through the day as best they can. Those who can immigrate do so. A lot of people have immigrated. The Lebanese have always been a big immigrating country, but more and more people are leaving simply because life is difficult. But life does go on. It's not like we're in a jungle. That when I was in Beirut a few weeks ago, and you're walking in the streets, and if you didn't know what was going on, you'd think that it was just like a bit of a quiet Sunday morning or something. Some shops were not open. Traffic was less than usual, but the most day-to-day life was going on. Shops, restaurants, food stores, some pharmacies. But when you look under the surface, you see that there's great weakness, and people are responding by coming up with innovative ways to just care for themselves. People do barter economy, for instance. So if the cash economy, or actually the dollarized economy, if you don't have dollars, you only have Lebanese, liras, you're in trouble because they've lost a lot of their value. So people do barter deals with each other. People grow more food in their home in the mountains. Most people have an ancestral home somewhere. Yep. They grow more fruits and vegetables there. They work part-time jobs if they can. They go to charities. There's tremendous charitable aid and assistance, and there's a massive indigenous, spontaneous, self-help, community-based process going on. We're in local neighborhoods mostly where people know each other. They set up a free refrigerator where people can go and take food. They set up a free soup kitchen where people can get meals if they need hot meals, medical care. They help each other rebuild houses that were damaged in the blast. There's tremendous solidarity among people. So people are not dying in the street because of the collapse, but their quality of life has declined severely, and their future hopes have declined severely. So nobody knows how long the current stalemate is going to go on. Some people say it can't go on much longer. The reality is that it probably can go on much longer, but at a price of suffering by more and more Lebanese. And the danger here, of course, is that in this context, you open the door for corruption, for political violence, for interference from abroad, many ways to degrade the the integrity and the well-being of the society, whether through your own desperation at home or manipulation from abroad. And that's something that's happened to some extent, but people want to avoid it if they can.
Rami, thank you very much for your time and for your insights. We hope that we can call upon you again to keep us appraised of the situation in Lebanon as it unfolds.
My pleasure. Thanks for being with me, and good on you.
Thank you very much. American University of Beirut's Rami Khouri. That's it for this episode. We hope that you enjoyed the show. My thanks to our guest Rami Khouri and to producers Neil Smart and Malcolm Hughes. Thanks also to the Ozcast Network. You can find The Focus on the Sage International website at www.sageinternational.com.au, the Ozcast Network, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like us on our The Focus social media channels on Twitter and on Facebook. Or better yet, subscribe to the Sage International site to access our premium content, whether in audio or written form. Until next time, goodbye.
Earth Justice is a national legal nonprofit fighting to protect people's health, to preserve magnificent places and wildlife, and to combat climate change. Visit us at earthjustice.org. Earth Justice, because the Earth needs a good lawyer.
Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.